topic. Our topic today is protect your workplace, vaccination legal issues. Matthew, thank you so much for joining us today.
No problem. Thanks for having me, Todd. Looking very much forward to the discussion.
We do have a good crowd of our business community here, and we are streaming this live on Facebook as well. This series is one that we started a little over a year ago to help businesses, both large and small, pick up insights on real relevant issues that they're dealing with. And of course, with vaccinations being administered each week, with that growing, we're looking at many employees returning back to the workplace from home, and that brings a lot of different issues for employers. And I should let people know that you are well experienced in this area. You have had a practice in the employment, or I should say the employer side of law for a number of years now, representing management in areas of, well, everything from unionized environments, return to work legislation, regulations on health and safety, etc. You are also, I understand, an accomplished speaker on a range of topics and have taught labor law at Conestoga College. While at law school at the University of Windsor, we understand you won the prestigious J.W. Whiteside Award, and have been with Sherrard Kuzz. I guess you started there as a student and had a secondment with the Ontario Labour Relations Board, and so it's a very good background for today's topic. We're just so very, very happy that you're able to join us here today. This expert interview is brought to you through sponsorships. The Brampton Board of Trade has a number of virtual meetings, programs, series, etc. And this particular one is brought to us through the generosity of CN, as well as Toronto Pearson, the Deloitte, and Goodison Insurance as well. So thank you to those sponsors. Okay, Matthew, let's get right into it. I know here in Peel Region we have about 1.5 million in population. I understand the recent stats, we've got about 1.8, close to that, doses administered for adults across Ontario, or right around the 77% mark for one shot, and approaching, I guess we're just over 45% for those that are double vaccinated. We're seeing folks come back to work, and hey, I might be vaccinated, but a colleague of mine might not be, and that might bring some workplace issues. So I want to start off with employers' rights with respect to understanding the vaccination status of their employees. Can an employer require employee vaccination or disclosure of vaccination status?
So that's a great question, Todd, and thank you for the intro, and thank you for having me on. Very excited to be here. And that's a question we've been getting on an almost daily basis for quite some time now. And it's really something that impacts all employers, because you may be listening to this webinar and you may have been operating the whole time, like a warehouse, for example. You've got employees side by side, and now you're thinking about ways to improve the health and safety of your workforce. You may also be an employer that's had employees working remote, and now you're considering what your return to work policy is going to be. So this really is something that touches on all employers. The question about whether we can require vaccination, I'll sort of start out by giving a bit of a cop-out lawyer answer that you may be familiar with if you deal with lawyers on a regular basis, is it depends. And it's always going to be contextual. As a starting point, though, I would suggest that most employers will at the very least want to encourage vaccination. I think it's consistent with our obligations under the Occupational Health and Safety Act to provide a safe workplace for our employees. It helps reduce the risk of workplace transmission, obviously, and also helps reduce likelihood of any related absenteeism to COVID-19. The reason why I say it depends is your analysis is going to start on whether you're unionized or non-unionized. For our unionized employers, probably won't be a shock to hear this, but it's going to be more difficult to implement a mandatory vaccination policy. If you unilaterally implement it, the union will have the ability to grieve the policy, and it'll be on you to demonstrate that the policy is reasonable. And there's a KVP test from the case law that we have to go through. But really what an arbitrator is going to want a unionized employer to demonstrate is that the policy is reasonable. Have you considered sort of less intrusive means to achieve the same type of workplace goal? Has it been communicated to employees? And the big thing for this type of policy is it's going to have to balance privacy versus health and safety. And it's also going to depend on your type of workplace. So it's not going to be impossible in a unionized environment, but it certainly will be a lot more difficult, and something that I think you'll need to carefully consider. And at least with the employers that I work with on the unionized side, I have yet to see an employer implement a policy for any unionized environment. But what I have seen, which is maybe a little bit different than we're used to, is some good collaboration between unions and employers, where they're putting on joint information sessions, for example, and educational sessions to try to maybe debunk some of the hesitancy around the vaccine. So if you are in a unionized environment, the key takeaway is it can be done, but it's probably going to be difficult to uphold at an arbitration, but you may be able to seek other means of trying to encourage vaccination, and perhaps by reaching out to your union to see if they can assist with some education. On the non-union side of things, it's going to be significantly easier to implement a mandatory vaccination policy. And the reason why I say it depends from a non-union perspective is I think there's two considerations. And this is often the case. You've got a legal consideration and you've got a practical consideration. From a legal side of things, a non-union employer can absolutely implement a mandatory vaccination policy to make it a requirement that employees are vaccinated, and you can require that they disclose proof of that vaccination. However, the policy should contain an exemption for those employees who cannot be vaccinated on the basis of a human rights code protected ground. So most of us are probably familiar with the Human Rights Code. It sets out a number of enumerated grounds that protect employees from discrimination on that basis. When we're talking about vaccination, the two big ones are disability and religion. So if somebody has a bona fide medical condition that does not allow them to be vaccinated, we would suggest you exempt them from the policy. Same if somebody has a sincerely held religious belief that they cannot be vaccinated, we would suggest that exemption from the policy. So yes, you can do it, but we would suggest having an exemption for human rights code protections. And if an employee comes to you and says, hey, well, I can't take it on the basis of a medical issue, you're entitled as an employer to request evidence that's reasonable in the circumstances. So a doctor's note, for example. So that's the legal side of things. You can do it. Strongly would suggest having a carve out for human rights code protections. The practical side of things is this. If an employee refuses on the basis of personal choice, that's not going to be protected under the Human Rights Code. But if they say, you know what, I'm not getting vaccinated, and they show up into the office or they show up into the warehouse the next day, what are we going to do, right? And so I think that's what we have to consider. And a couple of options are perhaps first trying a non-disciplinary response, thinking about that some of that education and information that I spoke about earlier, seeing if we can encourage them to reach the decision on their own. You may want to consider an unpaid leave of absence until such time that they change their minds and get the vaccines. Or you may want to consider terminating the employee's employment. The reason why that's a practical consideration is that I think in the vast majority of workplaces, you're not going to be able to terminate for cause, right? So I don't think you'll be able to successfully say, if you don't take the vaccination, you're terminated and not entitled to anything. The employee will very likely be entitled to their Employment Standards Act statutory notice. And if they don't have a contract that limits them to only that notice, common law notice as well. So that would be a bit of a financial decision that you need to think about. So that's what I've been discussing with employers is you can do it, but we've got to think about practically how we want this to play out. Another approach for your non-union environment is for new employees, or if you anticipate, sort of business picking back up again or needing to rehire as things return to normal, you can include that an employee is vaccinated right in their employment agreement as a condition of employment. So that's another piece as well to consider from a non-union standpoint.
Very good. And thank you for drawing some really practical applications of the legal issues and legal questions. So thank you for that hiring one. I was not aware that you're able to put that in as a requirement for hiring. Matthew, we have another very practical question that came in our chat, particularly in the Brampton community. We have a lot of workers that are mobile, working, traveling across borders. I know that many that are getting vaccinated are looking, to visit family and outside of Canada. And this question comes. And let me just read it. The Ontario government advises people should self-isolate for 14 days when traveling outside of Ontario, but no need to quarantine. So in the workplace, should we require employees to self-isolate after travel if they're unvaccinated? And what about for vaccinated employees? Would they need to self-isolate as well?
Yeah, so those are great questions, good practical considerations. The one piece I just wanted to add on the hiring, the same Human Rights Code exemption I spoke about for existing employees, you'd want to include that in your offer letter as well, in case somebody couldn't be vaccinated for a medical reason. In terms of the travel and the vaccinations and self-isolations, it's an excellent question. And I think this sort of highlights what some of the maybe issues have been employers have had to face throughout the pandemic is there always seems to be a bit of a moving target in terms of what the public health guidance is. And I must admit, off the top of my head, I don't even know exactly where we are today. I know the federal government has changed some restrictions, but I think in terms of an employer and trying to defend your decision about whether somebody needs or doesn't need to self-isolate, I think turning to public health guidelines and relying on what the most up-to-date is, and even perhaps reaching out to your chief medical officer and Peel for some guidance is probably the best thing to do before implementing that type of decision. Certainly if somebody's not vaccinated, you can also go above and beyond those any orders. I think from my perspective, I look at the Occupational Health and Safety Act. It's written in such a broad way, right? Every reasonable precaution for the protection of the health and safety of workers in the workplace. If we know somebody's not vaccinated, asking them to stay out or self-isolate for 14 days when maybe they may not necessarily be a requirement, I think we can rely on the Occupational Health and Safety Act to say, well, we're going to keep you out. And of course, it also depends on what type of industry you're in. There's different rules if you're in long-term care, for example, or retirement home. So you'll want to check. But I think the short answer is our fallback is the Occupational Health and Safety Act, and follow the medical guidance and advice that's out there from our public health officials.
Great. I'm going to ask our team to put in the chat contact information for Peel Public Health, and that's good advice to keep monitoring that, because, as you say, it is sometimes a moving target. So another practical question we have from the audience, and that is, what about if we had a customer? As a business, we have a business customer, and that customer is asking us to verify that our staff is vaccinated before our staff visits their facility. What are some of the legal issues around who we can send to jobs and that requirement from the customer with respect to vaccinated employees?
So this is an excellent question, and one that touches on a few different considerations. I'll sort of give a bit of an example, right? If you think, like, let's sort of keep COVID and vaccinations outside of this, right? Let's say your customer said, I don't want Matt coming to my site. I just don't like him, or he was rude to somebody else, right? How would we handle that type of situation? We may say, okay, well, we're going to send someone else there, right? Maybe we'll discipline Matt. Maybe we'll move Matt to go work somewhere else. So I think that's sort of the framework for our analysis, is think about what we would do in the normal circumstances. And then now let's look at some of the specific considerations as it relates to COVID. The first thing is we should not be disclosing an employee's vaccination status to a third party without their consent. So I would suggest that you could ask employees for their status. That sort of touches on one of the first questions you had, Todd. Is in this example, yes, you can ask employees to disclose their status. What we've been suggesting is to say, you sort of say, yes, I've had the first dose or the second dose. No, I haven't, or I choose not to answer. We suggest allowing them the opportunity not to answer. If they don't answer, then I would suggest treating that as if the answer was no. So in your example, I think we would first ask employees if we could provide their consent to disclose to the customer that they are vaccinated and that they can attend. Then I think that the second question is, if they are not vaccinated or refusing to tell us, the question is why. If it's because of a human rights code related reason, right, and they've got a bona fide issue, well, then we don't have to send them there, right? It's the customer's rules. It's sort of a third party site, but we do have to look at accommodating them. And maybe that means sending them to a different customer site or figuring out, what else we can do to make sure they're not losing any income. If it's personal choice or they're refusing to answer, I think your liability or concern is less in that situation. You can look to if there's other avenues or options available to them, another customer, for example, that may not have this requirement, or you can just say, I'm sorry, this is the requirement of the customer. We'll let you know when the next opportunity comes up or whatever the case is. So you're sort of balancing your business relationship with the customer, which is obviously going to be very important here, the privacy interests of employees not to disclose, and then some potential accommodation issues depending on whether or not they can't get vaccinated for human rights code related reason.
Yeah, thank you, Matthew, for breaking that down into 3 component parts. And I guess the rule of thumb here is your vaccination status is private health information.
Absolutely, yeah.
And if I were to disclose it, I would require your consent. So that's something that's
Right.
very important to know.
Yeah.
Last month, the federal government, provincial government distributed something called rapid antigen testing, RATS, as a screening tool, and a number of employers are using it. What if an employee decides that or refuses to be tested through a rapid antigen testing? They may say that they're vaccinated, for example. Can they refuse the rat? I understand it's a swab in the nose, so not as invasive as the PCR, but nonetheless, some may have issue to refuse. What are their rights, and what is the employer's rights in that scenario?
So another great question. Union and non-union, a little bit different. I think for this type of specific question in a unionized environment, I think you have to look to see what your collective agreement says. There'll be a greater right to privacy for employees in a unionized environment. So you may have fewer options as an employer in those circumstances. In a non-unionized environment, the way I like to approach this is sort of look at it from a reasonableness perspective, right? And still think about our obligations under the Occupational Health and Safety Act. If somebody's vaccinated and refusing the test, and they've shown you proof of their vaccination, I think sort of that's obviously a good thing because we want more people vaccinated. I think it also depends on how often you're implementing the test, right? If you're asking an unvaccinated person to take it every single day, that's probably not going to be reasonable. But if you're asking them to take it, once a week, twice a week, it's probably more reasonable, and we can fall back on that Occupational Health and Safety Act obligation. And I think the literature, the medical suggestion also is, even though you're vaccinated, you still could potentially get it and could potentially spread it. So I think there is a reason to do it. The question is, if the employee says no and you say, for example, well, then you're not coming into the building today until you comply, what is our legal risk? Maybe the employee says a constructive dismissal, right? Maybe they try to say this is a unilateral change. It's not reasonable. I've therefore been terminated, and they quit and they try to come after you that way. I think that's probably not going to be successful for the employee. And I think we would have a strong defense. So, what I would suggest is if they continue to refuse, try to provide some education around why you're requiring it, even though they are vaccinated. If they continue to refuse, maybe you sort of look at giving them a bit of a grace period and giving them some notice to say, as of this date, if you don't participate in the test, we're going to treat it as a positive test, or we're going to ask you to go home, to try to get them to comply. Ultimately, if there's no human rights code related reason and it gets, things continue to progress, you may even be able to discipline it and terminate in those circumstances. What I think this question also raises is the importance of employment policies when you're dealing with things like vaccinations and the rat testing and those kinds of things, where we can have all this information set out ahead of time, what our policy is going to be, provided to employees, give them an opportunity to receive training on it and understand it, so that there are no surprises when these types of issues arise.
Yeah, always good to update the personnel policy manuals, particularly with the issues that are brought forward with the pandemic. But good advice there with respect to reasonableness. Also, I heard you say grace period in terms of contemplation time for the employee to become better educated about it and the consequences of refusal. Thank you, Matthew. This is very helpful. I know that some employers would like to know what percentage of their employees are vaccinated. And one way of doing that would be a survey. That this information may be helpful to disclose to a customer, for example, or a potential new hire. What are some of the risks in asking that question in a survey, and what protections can we put when we ask that question, if we're able to ask that question in a survey? Any human rights issues we can avoid in a survey?
Yeah, so another great question. And again, I know I'm kind of repeating myself, a bit of a different analysis for unionized versus non-union environment. I think in both unionized and non-unionized, though, you can ask that question, and you can request the survey. I know in long-term care homes and retirement homes, you're required as an employer under their regulations to ask these questions. So if you want to go about asking for a survey, I think the first question we need to ask ourselves is, sort of why do we need this information? A lot of employers don't have a mandatory vaccination policy. They're going more with the strongly encouraged, but they say, well, we nevertheless want to know. And my question back is, well, if you're not going to make it mandatory, do you really need to know? And some of them say, well, you know what, maybe we don't. Others, to your point, Todd, might say, well, I do, because a customer, needs to know this. So I think you can ask, right? And what I would suggest is asking sort of three questions. It's, an opportunity to say yes, an opportunity to say no, and an opportunity to avoid, say, I choose not to respond. But advise the employee that if they're not going to respond, we're going to treat that as if you've said no. I think there are also some helpful tips to try to encourage compliance with the policy. You'll want to be very clear in the survey that, how you're, like, who's going to view this information, how it's going to be protected, and specifically ask for consent if you're going to provide it to a third party. And if the employee chooses not to provide their consent, because it is, it is personal medical information, so that can help put some minds at ease. And then again, if you're going to require the consent, you can say, if you've answered no for a human rights code related reason, you can ask them to provide that information. But really what you're trying to balance here, again, is health and safety of your workplace and your customers, the privacy interests of employees, and human rights code considerations. But you can absolutely do that kind of survey. Just sort of keep those three pieces in mind is how I think is the best way to implement something like that.
Very good advice on how to ask. Yes, you can ask the question, how to ask the question, and to be clear on how you're going to use it, and if you are going to share it, to ensure that there is consent. Thank you for that. Let's talk a little bit about incentivization. We've read some interesting stories of unique incentives and prizes that some companies have in other parts of North America. But what are you hearing from your employers, and what strategies are employers using to incent employees to vaccinate?
Yeah, not a lot of employers are doing the $1 million lottery like I think I saw Ohio doing, for example. But a lot of employers are doing that educational approach. and then coming up with ways to try to incentivize employees. Another reason why, perhaps the incentivization route is a good route to go is it also helps justify the collection of that information, right? So to say, well, we need to know, because if you don't provide us with this information, then, you obviously aren't going to be able to get the incentive. So what we've seen, I think most common are employers considering, like some sort of like bonus, vaccination bonus. I've also seen some employers do like additional paid time off, for example, as an incentive for additional vacation days, sort of understanding that there'll be a relaxation of the personal protective equipment rules in accordance with public health guidelines. Like, that's not necessarily an employer incentive like a bonus might be, but it's sort of a good educational piece to say, as restrictions ease for vaccinated people, we'll follow those public health guidelines, for example. But those are probably the biggest ones I've seen: vaccination bonus and an additional vacation time off. And what I've even seen, and I don't remember the name of the doctor off the top of my head, but I know there's an ability to, and I think some businesses in Brampton region did this, was, bring vaccination to the workplace, right? Try to make it accessible for employees. And if you've got sort of, a mobile vaccination unit on site, combined with the incentive, that may help boost your number of a vaccinated employee. So those are some of the things that we're seeing, and it's something that you can absolutely do as an employer. Probably even on the unionized environment, not much of a concern. Although depending on your relationship with the union, you may want to reach out to them first to let them know that you're doing it, or have a discussion with them in advance. I'd have a hard time seeing a union say no, but it will certainly depend on who the union is, what your relationship, and those kinds of things. But those are some of the strategies you can implement to try to incentivize employees to become vaccinated.
Thank you, Matthew. Monetary bonus, time in lieu, and I like what you said, the third one there, in terms of, there's lots of anxiety and uncertainty out there, to give an indication of what the future might hold in terms of relaxing on certain PPE as a result of vaccination. Another very good incentive. We have another question from our audience, some excellent questions coming in, and I think this one stems around perceptions of fairness. If we opt not to mandate vaccinations, are there any legal issues with having two sets of rules? Rules for vaccinated versus non-vaccinated. So, for example, non-vaxxed people must wear masks, vaxxed do not. Any issues around two sets of rules?
Yeah, so great question. And again, it really highlights the sort of legal issues and the practical nature. I think you've got maybe a practical problem with employee sort of morale, and maybe some divisiveness within the workplace. From a legal standpoint, if we're following public health guidance on requirements for vaccinated individuals versus non-vaccinated individuals, I don't have a lot of concern from a legal standpoint if we can point to, hey, this person is not required to wear a mask because they've been vaccinated. You are required to wear a mask because the current guidance from public health is unvaccinated individuals must continue to wear masks, for example, right? And that's sort of that incentivization piece. Like, that might incentivize someone to go out and get vaccinated. So no concern there. The potential issue is, and it's come up a few times in a few questions, is a human rights code consideration. So if somebody can't be vaccinated and we have a separate, because of a bona fide human rights code reason, that may require us looking at some other forms of accommodation aside from just personal protective equipment. But if there's no human rights code related issue from a legal standpoint, so long as we can fall back, again, to public health following guidelines as it relates to what vaccinated individuals can do and can't do versus unvaccinated individuals, I think we're in a good spot if challenged.
Great. Thank you. That's very good. I know we're close to our time, but I do see another very practical question. An employee, we require, we can ask an employee if they're vaccinated, and we need their consent if we communicate that. What if the employee lies? What if, can we ask for verification of the vaccination?
Yes, so absolutely, particularly in a non-union environment, right? So I'll just sort of have that caveat at the beginning. And this is why it's also, helpful to have a policy and just set right out in the policy, we are going to require proof of vaccination. So you can absolutely require that. And I think what we can do is set out, what the proofs, what kind of proof, right, we're going to accept, right? And I know when I got my second dose, you get a little, piece of paper and you can go online and get that. So you can require proof. What I would also suggest is that you set out in the policy that just talks about, that it's not going to be distributed without their consent, and those kinds of things. But short answer is, yes, you can require proof as part of your policy.
All right, very good. Here's the last question then. Take us through maybe steps or an approach that an employer wants to take as they relax their PPE requirements, masking, physical distancing, etc., for vaccinated employees. I know we've talked about it earlier in some earlier questions, but is there a particular approach that should be taken, steps, and does it differ in a unionized environment?
Yeah, so great question. So I think there's kind of a couple of things you want to think about. The first is we want to continuously make sure we're checking the most up-to-date public health guidelines. And I know there's probably a few of you rolling your eyes as I say that, because the information has been a bit sort of jumbled at times to try to nail down. But I think that's the most important thing, is to ensure that we're still complying with public health and any orders that are out there. The second thing is, and I think this is maybe a bit more important if you've had a workplace that's been primarily working from home, is as you're bringing people back to the workplace, think about, what type of notice you're going to provide, after employees have been, away from the workplace for a year and a half, as opposed to just saying, hey, you're coming back tomorrow, right? So that it's clearly set out to employees so that we can try to encourage their return. But I think those are really the steps, is think about the notice, think about, how you may phase in your approach to relaxing PPE, for example. And then I think what you also have to consider when you're talking about phasing in PPE, and it's what we just spoke about, is, are we going to have two different sets of rules or treat those that are vaccinated and not vaccinated differently? But I think ultimately what we're doing is following the public health guidance and coming up with our policies based on what that guidance tells us.
Very good. Well, thank you, Matthew. I like how you characterized, I think the words and wording in your profession is very, very important in the workplaces. Well, I heard you say welcoming employees back to the workplace as opposed to return to work, because there's been a lot of work going on at home.
Exactly. Yeah. First, that's a great point. Yeah. And maybe just very quickly, the last piece I'll add is, if you want to go onto our website, you have an opportunity to sign up for our newsletter. And, as these regulations and things change, we get information out in like a briefing note within a day or two. So it's a good way to sort of stay up to date on the most recent types of changes and guidelines by public health, Ministry of Labor, all those kinds of things.
Very good. And we put in the chat sherrardkuzz.com for additional information. Thank you for that. Matthew, do you have time for one more question?
Absolutely. Yeah.
Here's a good one. What if public health at the right time, what if public health guidelines relax so that there's not a need to wear a mask in the workplace, but management, in order to make customers feel as confident in returning, would require them to continue to be worn as part of their policy? Is that possible, and what would you recommend in that scenario?
Yeah, so the questions today have been really excellent. Again, so unionized environment, that's probably going to be more difficult. But in a non-unionized environment, I think you could still, even if public health is not requiring the use of a mask, I think you depending on the workplace and depending on the reason why, I think you could still have that as a requirement. The question is then, okay, if we implement it, what's the potential pushback from a practical standpoint from an employee? There's a constructive dismissal risk, I think. You've never required me to work a mask, anymore, like outside of COVID. Public health says I don't need to wear a mask, right? So you're changing a term and condition of my employment. I think the risk is probably like low on that standpoint. And I think for us, the fallback is, Occupational Health and Safety Act. We can still go above and beyond to try to do things, right? And we've got to balance that business element as well. So I think in certain, industries, customer facing, you probably still could implement that as a requirement. You may want to, again, provide notice to the employees that says, even if, public health has said this, but as of X date, we're going to require it as part of our, uniform policy, for example. Right. So that's another way to potentially reduce some liability is to provide some notice. And ultimately, if there's no human rights code related reason as to why the employee can't wear a mask, I think we'd be in good shape to uphold the decision if it was ever challenged by an employee, for example.
Right, very good. Matthew, you have really helped us to break down some very relevant questions that employers are dealing with right now. And you've provided us not only with insight on the requirements of an employer, but the risks that they should consider. And I heard throughout your responses reasonableness. A reasonable test can go a long way in many circumstances. So thank you for articulating the 3 R's for us and providing us with relevant approaches to some very practical problems. And I look forward to our next session together in the future. I want to thank Sherrard Kuzz for their sponsorship of our talent network, which will start again this fall. For those that are watching here today, there are lots of opportunities for you to engage with peers, with folks in your sector, in other sectors through the Brampton Board of Trade. One of those options is next week, July 15th at the noon hour. Please join us for open door discussions. This is an opportunity to talk about your business, some challenges, some opportunities. We try to match you with the people, the services, the programs that can help you succeed and succeed faster. Please also mark September 7th on your calendar for our next expert interview, and that will be on the topic of avoiding hacks and attacks, tips for better cybersecurity. So ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for your attention here today. A reminder, August 15th is the deadline for the nominations for the top 40 under 40. The Brampton Board of Trade manages and leads that program here in Brampton. And I know you know some folks that are under 40 that are doing amazing things in your operations or maybe in your customers, your suppliers. Please use the online tool at the bramptonbot.com, top 40/top 40 to nominate an individual. I want to remind you again of Sherrard Kuzz website. That is sherrardkuzz.com, SHERRARDKUZZ.com. Matthew Badrov, thank you so much for your time today, and thank you for tuning in and for your amazing questions. We'll see you again real soon at the Brampton Board of Trade. Bye, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.